Hello, my name is Vanee Matsalia. Welcome to Educator Collaborative Spring Gathering 2024. I am an English teacher in San Bernardino, Southern California, and today we're going to talk a little bit about practical secondary literacy practices that foster growth and love, specifically love for reading. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn my slideshow into full screen so we can see everything there. So today I'm here as representative of the Educator Collaborative, but also as a representative of Transformational PD. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. I'm not going to do the Nearpod. Again, Vanee Matsalia. You can reach me at this webpage and this email address if you have any questions at the end of my presentation. I'm always happy to answer questions, and chat with anyone, share ideas, because I'm a classroom teacher. I know how we feel, educators, about getting PD from people who haven't been in a classroom for a while. And so that's why it's really important to me that I'm giving PD, that I'm using things that I'm doing right now in my classroom in real life. And so that's kind of going to be the way that we address this topic today, is teacher to teacher, educator to educator, secondary instructor to secondary instructor. Today we're going to keep it real. And we're going to get through this topic in a way that I think is going to be most useful for those of us who are still in a classroom and need those practical strategies for looking at secondary literacy. So I'm going to start with the facts. Let's talk about why we're doing this. So we all know the importance of literacy and the impacts it has on life. I put up some information from the World Literacy Federation. Individuals with low levels of literacy are more likely to experience poor employment opportunities, outcomes, and lower income. As a result, they often face welfare dependency, low self-esteem, higher levels of crime. Moreover, people with low level of literacy have limited ability to make important, informed decisions in everyday life. Like these are the same people who are going to be voting with us in a few years. So it's super important that they know how to make informed decisions as they go through life and filling out forms, job applications, understanding the government, medicine, their own health, nutritional labels, so much more. Furthermore, parents who are functionally illiterate often prioritize work before education. They have lower expectations in regard to schooling, and the children and parents who fail to complete primary school are more likely to follow in the footsteps and do likewise. So, lack of literacy becomes a self perpetuating cycle when we have our students who make it through our secondary educational system without becoming literate, functionally literate. They're more likely to raise children who become functionally illiterate. And we're going to be teaching those kids, and then there's kids too. And we keep perpetuating the problem. That is why it's so important that we understand that literacy is our job at secondary too. I know, I get it. I had this discussion. I've been on the wrong side of this discussion. That's for elementary school teachers. I don't teach how to read. That's not my job. I teach novels and standards. That's what I do. But I was wrong. You guys, we were wrong. We are literacy instructors. Part of our job is to make sure our children, our students are able to read and be able to function well in society, because let's be honest, they cannot function well in society without literacy. They're not going to engage with your content without literacy. And no, I'm not just talking to language arts and English teachers. This applies to all of us at the secondary level. This is not content specific. All of us are literacy instructors, and all of us bear the burden of literacy instruction. Um, I say burden, but when you find the sweet, easy way of getting into it and getting it done, it's really a joy, and something that I think once you get a hang of, that you'll realize you do a lot of it anyway. And once we become really intentional about doing these processes, we can be more effective for the communities that we serve. All right, so here's some of the figures. I looked at the reading scores for eighth grade and 12th grade. So we've got that early adolescent, and then we've got that late adolescent. And if you look at the data here, you're going to see that reading scores for eighth graders, according to the NAEP, have been trending down, and that's pretty consistent across all percentiles. The reading scores are decreasing from lower and middle and higher performing eighth graders. All eighth graders are performing lower than they have before. And then what you'll see in high school is a little bit of a shift. We have a trend down where our lower performing readers are reading less and reading poorer, and our higher performing readers are reading more and reading better. And what that means is, it's like, well, isn't that good? No, it's not. That means the gap is getting bigger. The gap is getting bigger between our literate and illiterate students. And that's a problem. The numbers aren't huge, but the gap is expanding. And that can be a real problem, especially when we understand which students are more likely to fall in that gap and the ones who are more likely to be underserved by our schools with literacy instruction and all instruction. It becomes a serious equity issue when you see gaps like this showing up. So this is not something that we can ignore. Our reading levels dropping is not something we can ignore as secondary teachers. We have a stake in this. Why is it when they get to us, literacy levels start going down? It may be because there's less targeted literacy instruction in secondary ed. And that's something that we have the power to change. I don't see that as a bad thing. When I see that there's an area where I have power to make a difference, I see that as something great. See that as something empowering. I have the power in my classroom, my day-to-day classroom, to make an impact on these numbers. I have the power in my classroom, and so do you, to help bridge that gap. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about some simple steps and tips to do it. And I know the idea of saying literacy and simple steps sounds wild, right? But it is. It's really, I don't want to say it's not science, because it's definitely science, but it's also an art. And once you learn how to put those things together, it blends into curriculum quite beautifully. So here's the truth. We talked about the facts and the figures. Let's look at the truth. We had a lot to do in secondary ed. We're busy. We're busy. We have constant testing. You've got your state test, your district test, your common assessments, your NWEAs, the CAASPs. We have so much assessment that we get super assessment driven. If it's not on the state test, if there's not a question on it, I'm not teaching it kind of culture that tends to permeate secondary education. And it puts a lot of stress and weight on us as secondary educators. We can't pretend like we don't have that burden on us. We do. That part, I think, is a bit of a burden. We also have high volume grading. We don't have 24 kids. I have 180. You might have 240. And yes, while elementary school teachers, no shade to elementary school teachers, you guys are heroes in my book. They grade every subject, everything all day. We grade a lot of the same thing over and over and over and over. And forgive my going on, but I just finished grading 180 something essays last week and giving targeted feedback for every single one. So you can forgive my repetition, but that's how it feels. And so there's always something else to do. We have extracurriculars. We still have to do with the politicization of learning, especially right now, the politicization of literacy and the reading wars and the phonics and the science of reading versus the whole reading. And there's all of that going on, competing and battling for our attention. And that doesn't even begin to touch on the big thing. We're held accountable to our standards. At the end of the day, we're held accountable to either our standards or our curriculum. And oftentimes, you won't find literacy in either one of them. Literacy practice are things you have to build inside and around and through your curriculum, but it's probably not in there, not in secondary. And so the truth is that's overwhelming, and that is a lot. And that can feel like enough to just make you want to shut down. I get it. I know. I'm still in the classroom full time. This is what we deal with. However, The other side of that truth is when we are intentional about building in our literacy standards, it will help with our constant testing because the only proven strategy to raise test scores is raising literacy. It will help us with that grading. When our students are better readers, they are better writers. They better understand our rubrics. They are more apt to be successful in these areas. It doesn't do much for your clubs and activities, but nothing's going to do that and do away with that. We're secondary. But when we have a good understanding of literacy practice, we don't have to worry about getting pulled into the polarizing reading wars conversations. We're just focused on best practices and literacy instruction. We don't need to take a side. We're taking the side of research. We're not taking the side of any political party. We're not taking the side of any camp on a reading war. We're taking the side of literacy and children. And we use those things to enhance our standards and to bolster our curriculum so our students can have access to both of those things. Oh, I think I went backwards. One sec. So now that we know all that, now what? Well, we rely on the research. We go out and see the research, not the science of reading, the research. There are decades and decades of research on literacy, including the science of reading pieces like phonics and fluency and semantics of and all that. We have all that, and I'm not discounting any of that. All of those things are important, but we want to look at the big whole picture of literacy and not camps. We want to rely on what all the research says. We want to be able to then, once we know what the research says, creating a plan. You can't just jump into literacy instruction without having a plan. The upside to that is it does not have to be super complicated. It really doesn't. What it does have to be is targeted and intentional. And that's the part that I think we have to get really good at as secondary educators is being intentional with our literacy practices. Most of us do a lot of them on some of the time or some of them a lot of the time, but very few of us do all of them all the time or most of them most of the time, which is why we don't feel like we're literacy instructors. But when we become intentional and build literacy plan into our regular day-to-day, then we become literacy instructors without deviating from our curriculum or our core content. And of course, standing our ground. Right now, our culture is inundated with polarized politics and education and everyone taking a side. And when it comes to literacy instruction, you're going to hear people say things like in secondary, I know there are people who say, it's not my job. I'm a science teacher. That's not my job. I teach language arts standards. I don't teach how to read. That's not my job. That's not what I do. We don't need to do that. No, I don't want to hear your best practice on that. I'd rather focus on this test, on building the final, on the common assessment. You have to stand your ground and do what's right for your kids. You got to stand your ground and stand for what's right for the students and communities that we serve. Your standardized tests are not going to improve without better literacy instruction. It's not going to happen. There's no testing skill or testing tip or trick that can outmatch literacy. That is the ground and foundation of all education. So it really is in our hands. If we really want to see these gains and these gaps closing, we really have to focus on making sure our students are literate. All right, so I said all that just to say I do this in three, what I call simple steps. I kind of breaking it down for the way I'll do it. I'll also show you the research backed methods behind my three steps. But I assess reading as step number one. Step number two, we do targeted skill building. And step three, strategic reading. These three things are not something separate. It's not a separate curriculum. It's not something that I'm doing differently. These are things that I build in, pardon me, to my regular classroom that make literacy instruction a regular part of my life, a regular part of my students' lives, where they don't even know it's happening and people walk in and they don't realize what I'm doing. And it's just built in a way that's just so cohesive where literacy instruction is just always happening. And this is something that you can do. This is something your teams can do. Your whole school can pull this off and be successful without everyone stopping and focusing on how do we teach reading. It's built in here. We can do this and still focus on our content. First thing, diagnostic assessment. We have to measure a baseline. It's important that you know where you're starting. You don't know if you're being effective if you don't know where you're starting. So having a baseline data of some sort is remarkably important when we're looking at literacy instruction. I'm not going to say which baseline is best. There's a bunch. There are lots of baselines. Oh, pardon me. Reading diagnostics that you can look at. But what you have to do is find what's going to be easiest for you. For me, as a secondary teacher, considering how many students I have and how many of my kids are on IEPs and which one of my students are EL learners, and if they're EL 1, 2, 3, or 4 learner, I've got a 504 plan. I have a lot to manage. So I have to remember when I'm looking for something to diagnose reading, I am finding the easiest, simplest thing I can. It has to be easy for me. It has to be easy for my kids. And it has to be really easy for my admin. Because if they're going to question, what are you doing? This is not in your pacing guide. This is not a part in your textbook. I need to be able to make it real simple. I need to be able to explain it really clearly so everyone gets it, everyone understands, and it's accessible. My kids can do it. My kids know why they're doing it. I can see it. I can see why I'm doing it. I can go back and check it. I can go back and check for growth. If your diagnostic doesn't allow you to see growth over time, then it's not a good diagnostic. It's not a diagnostic. So I have to keep it simple. I have to make sure I'm collecting that baseline data. Then I have to be consistent. I have to be able to do it more than one time in a way that's not going to derail my class, but also I need to be able to do it enough times where I'm going to be able to see growth. Are the things I'm doing in my class being effective? Am I impacting literacy? And you should be able to measure that if you're being consistent, keeping it simple. All right, so I said there's a bunch of diagnostic assessments out there. We all know Renaissance Star, there's iReady, there's the NWA Map Data, there's the iExcel, they've got the phonics and reading skills at Mentum, ExactPath, Who's Reading. There's not one good answer. I'm not going to say there's one diagnostic that uh, is the best. Okay, it's not the one ring to destroy them all. It's a reading diagnostic. As long as it can give you baseline and track growth from there, it will work. Personally, because again, I'm a secondary teacher. I have 50-minute class periods. I'm going to have another 35 kids in my room every 50 minutes. I want it to be simple because I got to get to this novel we're reading. I got to get to these articles. We're in the middle of writing an essay. I need to be able to make sure I can do it several times. So it needs to be fast, to the point, and effectively gather what I need. I like using the reading diagnostic on either, pardon me, Star or Who's Reading. Those are my two favorites. Just because, again, I care about time. I need the most bang for my buck. And for me, the most bang for my buck comes from either one of these. Star, because we have to do that at my site anyway for our English language learners assessments. So a lot of my kids are familiar with that. My student is 86%. My school site is 86% Latino. So I'm able to see that data pretty easily. Most of my kids know how to use the star. And then Who's Reading, I just love it because it's high engagement. The students get to choose their own text when they're doing the assessment. They can pick whatever they want, and a lot of the times, I think with diagnostics, what we get wrong is they're so boring, and the kids have no interest in it, and so it might be accurately diagnosing them for the first 5 or 10 minutes, but once you make it past that 10-minute mark, you're not diagnosing their reading, you're diagnosing their boredom, and so I don't find the scores to be super accurate when a diagnostic test goes longer than that, which is why I do like STAR because it's fast. But Who's Reading I enjoy because the students on that assessment, they get to pick what they want to read. There is a whole library of things they get to click to pick a subject they're interested in. Once they figure it out, they just click through using the vocabulary. It is not like answering questions or just clicking things. based on vocabulary and understanding the words on the screen. And it gives me a really clear picture of where my kids are. And they're less bored and they're not checking out on me because they chose what they wanted to read. And it's something that we can do over time. That's my favorite thing about Who's Reading. I don't have to sit there and do the assessment in one sit. I can say, guys, our starters for this whole week is going to be the um, Who's Reading assessment. You're going to go in and they're called reading challenges. So you're going to go in and do reading challenges until your bar is filled. Every day for the first 10 minutes of class, we're doing reading challenges instead of journals and silent reading. Bam, 1 week I'm done. Or on our short Mondays, my school site, or my whole school district, we have short Mondays, early release, because we do our PD on Mondays. So the kids get to school later, so the periods are 30 minutes long. Okay, today everyone's doing the reading challenges. That's our whole lesson for the short Monday. In the 30 minutes, I can't teach a whole lesson anyway. I do that assessment probably 3 or 4 times a year just so I can see where my students are growing. Are they changing? Are they dropping? Where are they and how do I know? So it doesn't matter which one you like. Those are the two I like. It doesn't really, you can pick any of the many diagnostics, but please research them and make sure you understand them first and how much time they're going to take, how much they cost. My school district pays for star reading. So I don't have to worry about that. I know star reading is in many, many school districts. So check to see if you have it already. If you have it already and it's free, use it. If you already have iReady, that data's already there, go for it, use it. I like right now, Who's Reading Gold, which lets you do the assessment, is normally not free, but it's been free for the last, I want to say, year, and I think they said it's going to be free for the next upcoming year because I believe the Who's Reading program just got bought out by Savas. So I believe during this transition, it's been free, and I have had to pay for it very rarely because I was a beta tester when they were first starting. But I think that it's for the low cost of what it is when they do charge. I think is worth it because it has a whole suite of things that help me with literacy instruction. It's not just the assessment. There's a whole bunch of high engagement, fun stuff that helps me keep my kids engaged in the reading. So find which one works for you. Find which path works for you and choose that and be consistent to it. Don't flip flop throughout the year. Once you pick one, stick with that one. Because if you're switching, your data is not going to match. It's going to be comparing apples to oranges. So whatever a diagnostic tool you choose to stick with, that's the one you got to use till you're done. So find something you can access, find what your district already offers, pick that one, and roll with it. Once you have your baseline data, this is when we look at our targeted skill building. When we're looking at improving adolescent literacy, there are some research backed, research proven, teacher tested effective classroom intervention practices. This is the International Education. Oh man, now the word has left my head. Research Network. This is the What Works Clearinghouse. And this is filled with just years of data about what practices work. And these are the recommended practices for adolescent literacy, for targeted skill building, explicit vocabulary instruction, direct and explicit comprehension strategies, providing opportunities for extended discussion of text and interpretation, increasing student motivation and engagement in literacy, make available intensive individualized interventions. Notice none of these say test prep on it. You're not going to see anything that says get the kid ready for the state test, do state test prep packets. That's not an effective classroom intervention for improving adolescent literacy. So when we're looking at literacy, there's some proven things that we know work. And if you look over here on the right hand side, you'll see that all of these are backed with strong evidence, especially the vocabulary instruction and the intervention. And then tier 3 means it's very promising. So this is all good news. So it means you can't really lose with anything in here. You're not going to lose anything. All you can do is gain, no losses. So now that we've talked about all those terms and whatnot, let's see what that looks like in real life. Because again, I'm just going to keep it real. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about research. I want to talk about what I'm doing for real in class, what you need to do for real in class. Explicit vocabulary instruction. Here are some recommendations I took from that same site. dedicating a portion of regular classroom lessons to explicit vocabulary instruction. We do that, a lot of us, but it has to be, again, going back to that word, intentional, and it has to be systemic. It has to be built in on a regular basis. Once you build in that vocabulary instruction, it has to be not just built in, but if you go to the next box, it has to be repeated exposure of that language under multiple contexts, allowing for sufficient practice with vocabulary words, with reading new words. If we do not, we can't just teach the kids the words and give them notes and we never look at it again. We can't. That's not going to be useful. They're going to forget it. They have to be put in a position to have to use that language, check back with their notes, add to their notes, annotate their notes, so that every time they're going back in, they're having a new interaction with the text, new interaction with those words, so that they're getting it down to automaticity. You have to give sufficient opportunities to use the new vocabulary in a variety of contexts, such as during writing, during group conversation, during reading time. They have to be able to have access to language over and over and over again. That's super important for adolescent literacy instruction, especially when it comes to a vocabulary piece. And then we have to provide them with strategies to make them become independent vocabulary learners. We can't do it all for them. There's a couple of different ways that I do that. You'll see here a screenshot of video of me teaching. I do not just the academic language, like analyze, evaluate informational text, the standards language. I go through and I look at important terms in the context of whatever the theme of my unit is. This unit that's showing up here is injustice in U.S. history. We have to talk about what does injustice mean. What are motives? When we say things are about economic gain, what does that mean? What's economic? When someone is offended, what does offend mean? We need to break those terms down. As you can see, I don't always use long definitions. Sometimes it's just one word, symbols for dollar signs. I keep it very simple because I need these things to be something we interact with a lot. Those words are going to come out a lot in my unit, even though they're not the academic vocabulary. I still take the time to explicitly pre-teach them before my kids start trying to read articles packed with those words. And then when we do get to the article, they might say, "Oh, I remember writing that." And even if they don't remember to write that, my answer is always going to be open up your notebook and check your vocabulary, check for your vocab while you're reading, while you're doing your article. So they're consistently going back and interacting with it. Seeing that word, "Oh, I think that word is in my notes. Let me go back and see what it said about that." Making sure we're doing that explicit. And I've got two versions of it. Sometimes I lecture and I do it with them. Sometimes I give my students the introduction to the unit with the main idea. That's the theme specific language, the academic knowledge that's content, and the outcome that's content specific. And so then they have to have that article with their small groups or their partners. They have to pull out all the relevant information and build notes for themselves. So sometimes it's direct instruction, sometimes it's instruction where they have to go in and dig, because I'm teaching them to become independent vocabulary learners. How do I read a text and pull word meaning out of it? Is it more difficult for my EL students or my students who come in with a lower reading level? Yeah. So I have them chunk. That's why they work in small groups. So I can say, you guys go ahead and pick which of those 4 paragraphs you feel more comfortable. And then I'm going to come back in 2 minutes. And then I'm going to check to make sure everyone has a paragraph they're more comfortable pulling the notes from. And then I might say for my EL student, why don't you do paragraph number 2? Because I see it's the simplest, at the least amount of terms, and they might be able to focus a little bit more and not get overwhelmed. Or for my students who have a processing disorder or a visual disability. And that way I'm able to stop and focus on that with my literacy or my vocabulary instruction, and they can pull it out. When I'm doing narratives, like this is my chapter notes. This is what my chapter notes look like, a digital version. We generally do them by hand in my classroom. I'm making them interact with the text. We're not going to be marking up the novels. We can't do that. I work in a public school. That's not a thing. But we can take notes on all the events as they happen and summarize those events in our own words. We're going to take down any vocabulary we don't know. We're going to look it up. Type that word in and look it up. My students for that chapter, what is this? Chapter 3 of the Hunger Games, they chose emaciated, deluge, and amiable. They didn't know what those words meant. Oh, okay, bet. Let's look it up. And now that word goes in their new vocab. And when they build their group dictionary for this unit, they'll have that there. They'll have to go and they'll have to interact with it a second time and a third time. helping to build those words into their vocabulary, helping them become more literate. When I'm looking at comprehension strategies, moving on from vocabulary, there are a ton of comprehension strategies. We engage with the text. We find engaging text. Okay, let's just keep it real, you guys. Sometimes as secondary teachers, we are really guilty of picking on something that we want to read about without ever seeing what our students are interested in. Why would I engage with your reading practices if we're reading about something that I have zero interest in? Oh, pardon me. Sorry, you guys. In the real world, you can't always read things that you like. You're right. I can't always read what I want when it's time to do my taxes. That's why I hire somebody to do it for me. In the real world, you do have access to choice, and we do have to start being more realistic with our students and stop trying to make them suffer the indignities we had to suffer just because we had to suffer them. Find topics that your students are interested in. I do the achievement gap in our education unit and talk about Latino and African American students specifically and pull articles on those because those are the people groups in my classroom. And so they're more likely to engage with that text. We annotate the text. I make sure we pause halfway through and we identify the central idea. We're finding details that support that central idea. To identify a central idea, I have to stop and pay attention to the words I'm reading and figure out what it's trying to say to me. That's a comprehension strategy. Pausing, looking back over the words and saying, what is it saying to me? That's why we annotate our text. And as always, you'll notice I'm always doing vocabulary instruction. My students are always going to be pulling out words they don't know and dropping in the definition, looking it up and dropping the definition in a comment bubble or on paper with handwritten. We are always, 100% of the time, going to be annotating and going back and focusing on vocabulary. Having the students summarize what they read is an important reading comprehension skill. Finding the same main or central idea, instructing on text type. You'll be surprised how many times I'll say, all right, we're moving on to informational text, and my students have no idea what I'm talking about. So I've tied that instruction into my formal style. We have the formal style standard in our writing standards. And so I always make sure to understand, well, we're reading a narrative, so we need to figure out what formal style we're going to be using to cite for this whole unit. If all this unit, while we're looking at the narratives, what are we citing with, APA or MLA? And I teach my kids at the beginning, MLA is from when we're looking at narratives, APA is from when we're looking at informational text. Yes, I know that's not clear cut and necessarily 100% true, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm teaching my students how to identify a specific type of text and then know how to cite for that text based on what they're looking for. That is another in-depth reading comprehension skill that we can do with whatever you're reading. If you're reading an article on movement or on space travel or I don't know, President Jackson, whomever, whatever. These are skills that you can be embedding into that all the time to make sure you're supporting reading comprehension literacy standard strategies. And then, of course, determining purpose and audience has to do with identifying what kind of text you're working with. Step 3, strategic reading. High interest, whole class text. You guys, we got to be strategic about what we're teaching. It's got to be interesting. Not us interesting, the people sitting in your desks interesting. When we're doing whole group text, you guys, I know I'm an English teacher. I love Shakespeare. I love Jane Austen. I do, but I don't teach them because my 8th graders don't care. I have to sacrifice what I love to do, what my students are going to need. I need them to be interested so that I can get them to use those other literacy strategies. So choosing high interest whole class text is key to good literacy instruction in secondary. And then we have high engagement self-selected independent reading. Yes, the big giant sentence to say independent reading. We can't let go of it. I I know for the people who say you should be doing test taking skills doing your starters or SEL doing your starters. I do all those things too, but I'm never going to get rid of high engagement self selected independent reading because there is a ton of research that supports that high engagement, self-selected, independent reading. Yes, I know it's a lot of words. I next time I'll use the acronym. But this type of reading has a direct impact on test scores and graduation rates and successful life because it increases your literacy. You guys, we gotta let the kids read. We have to let them read for fun. We have to let them read for joy. We have to let them read for interest, not just the things we're teaching because Othello is my thing. Othello might be their thing later, but right now, they totally are into Fortnite and want to read Game Informer. Right now, they're totally into the relationship phase and boy crazy. So Lore Olympus is where it's at. The teen drama, so Vixen NYC. Find where your kids are at and ask them and get those kinds of books in their hands. It's important for them to have these books in their hands. If not, we're not going to see an increase in literacy. This third step, strategic reading, is incredibly important. And if we skip this step, we're handicapping ourselves when it comes to literacy instruction. Our kids need this from us. And that takes us to the same page we started on, intervention. There, when you come across, you've done your strategic reading, you're doing your instruction, you're looking at your data and you're saying, man, I've got a group of kids who are really struggling. This is when you go back to your programs and you find what interventions they have. Most of these programs that you have for collected baseline data will have interventions built in. I'm going to take the liberty of actually showing you mine. Because again, like I said, I am still a classroom teacher. Teaching is still my love. I use Who's Reading, and they have activities. And what I love about the activities is I can see that right now I have it put on vocabulary because I have a group of students who are struggling with vocabulary. So these are just interventions that you can build into your starters. Today, everyone's doing Who's Reading. The kids don't know they're all getting a different activity based on their needs. They have no idea. All they know is that they're getting a Who's Reading assignment. So right now, my kids are focused on art and vocabulary. So I know that there's some kids who really need to work on that. So I'm going to assign this to those specific kids. I'm going to assign based who the author is. And it's the program. That's why I love Who's Reading. It does all the scoring. I don't have to do any scoring at all. The scoring is done for me. And so that's my favorite part. And it gives my students feedback, targeted feedback based on their needs. And I absolutely love that. I can go and choose and look at my teacher picks. These are the things right now my kids are doing the Hunger Games. And so my kids are looking at the Hunger Games. They have to answer a certain amount of questions on it. They have to take a quiz. They have to do a book review. We're doing Hunger Games in class. We're taking notes. We're taking chapter tests. We're looking at articles discussing the civic implications of the Hunger Games, looking at the historical implications of the Hunger Games. And we're still doing all those standards-based things. But then they come in here and they do their reading instruction pieces, their literacy instruction pieces as just 10, 15-minute starters on Mondays and Wednesdays or Tuesdays and Thursdays or whenever to go along with my instruction. It's so important that we're building this in along with our instruction. And I just want to go and show these are my real notes. The things I was showing you. I really am. We really are building the vocabulary into it. This is the notes from my classroom. These are the things my students are writing. I really am giving them sentence stems to help them become more familiar with the words and language because that's the writing side of literacy. They can't write and understand the words if they don't have some example of it. We look at mentor texts. We learn how to cite. We're taking notes, summarizing what's happening in the text. We're taking all those research-based practices and we're putting them into play. This is an article for several units ago. We're still finding those words we don't know and talking about what they mean. We're annotating, we're finding the main idea and writing that in first before we're ever doing anything else. We go and look at our questions, see what does our question want us to know, and learning how to find that specifically in our reading, because that is an important step to in class secondary literacy instruction. These are all big things. And I know it could seem like, oh my gosh, this is so much. This is just too much. But you guys, it's not. This is stuff that we do regularly every day. We just have to get much better about building it in. And finally, I just want to say adolescent literacy is real, it's attainable, it's achievable, and it's well within our reach without sacrificing our broader content at large. This is something that we can do. It just takes a little planning and a lot of heart. Literacy instruction is within the grasp of every secondary teacher. Yes, I'm talking to math and science teachers too. All of these things that I just demonstrated and talked about are things that any instructor can do, and they will help increase your literacy by leaps and bounds. And I just want all of us to at least commit to trying something. Start somewhere, but make sure you're taking time to build in that love of reading and those literacy practices to help our secondary kids become the best readers that they can possibly be. Thank you so much for joining me and talking about secondary literacy. It has been my absolute pleasure to join the Educator Collaborative for another gathering, and I am so absolutely pleased to be here. If you ever have any questions or anything I talked about and you want to reach out to me, you can reach me at transformpd.com, or that's our website, or info at tpdconsults.com. You can also find me just by looking me up. I'm available to chat, and I'm available to talk a little bit more deeply about it if you want to look more deeply into these strategies and what they mean and how we use them. I want to engage with you, and I hope that you would like to engage with me. I want to wish everyone a phenomenal day. Thank you for joining us at the gathering, and I hope that you stay for all of the sessions and are able to pull as many gems of wisdom as you possibly can from this amazing group of educators. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Educator Collaborative.